The story of James Connolly begins not in the grandeur of palaces or the halls of power, but in the humble, soot-stained streets of Leith, near Edinburgh, Scotland, in the summer of 1868. Born into a working-class family, Connolly's earliest years were shaped by hardship and struggle. His father, a committed socialist, instilled in him the belief that the world could be changed, even as he passed away when James was only 11, leaving the young boy to face the harsh realities of poverty. From the moment he could walk, James was no stranger to labor. At 13, while other children played, he carried the weight of breadwinning responsibilities. Jobs were harsh and unrelenting, hauling coal, working on docks, feeling the sting of cold winds on the back of a tired, young boy. Yet, these early trials were not in vain. They forged in him an acute sense of justice and a fiery determination to challenge inequality wherever he saw it. Even as a boy, Connolly's mind was restless. He devoured books on politics, philosophy, and economics, searching for explanations for the suffering around him. He came to understand, at an age when many are still discovering the world, that poverty was not merely an accident, it was the result of a system that favored the wealthy while crushing the poor. And he refused to accept it. His brief stint in the British Army offered lessons of a different kind. While some would have accepted the rigid discipline and the order of military life, Connolly saw the stark contrast between the lives of the commanding officers and the ordinary soldiers. The army revealed the structures of authority, hierarchy, and power, lessons he would later apply to understanding the oppression of the Irish working class under British rule. In his late teens, Connolly's restless spirit carried him across the Irish Sea to Dublin, a city simmering with discontent. The streets were crowded, the air thick with the smoke of factories, and the cries of the hungry seemed to echo from every alleyway. Here, Connolly encountered the full force of economic exploitation intertwined with colonial domination. He saw children as young as he once was laboring in factories, men crushed under impossible working hours, and families trapped in squalor. It was in Dublin that Connolly's revolutionary consciousness fully awakened. He realized that the struggles of workers were inseparable from the struggle for Ireland itself. The fight for bread and the fight for freedom were one and the same. Connolly began to write, speak, and organize. His words were sharp, his actions decisive. He formed the foundations of what would become a life devoted to the melding of socialism with Irish nationalism, a vision that was radical, dangerous, and utterly compelling. By the end of his formative years, James Connolly had transformed from a poor Scottish boy into a young man whose ideas and resolve were unstoppable. His life was no longer about mere survival, it was about confronting injustice head-on, challenging authority, and igniting a movement that would one day shake a nation to its core. And thus, the stage was set. The boy who carried coal through the chill of Leith would grow into one of the most influential revolutionary leaders Ireland had ever seen. But before the world would recognize him, Connolly had to navigate the treacherous waters of political activism, labor unrest, and the awakening of a nation's desire for freedom, a journey that would define the next chapter of his extraordinary life. After arriving in Dublin in the late 1880s, James Connolly quickly realized that the city was a boiling pot of frustration, poverty, and political tension. The factories and docks hummed with the ceaseless toil of men and women whose lives were dictated by the whims of wealthy employers and the iron hand of colonial rule. Connolly did not merely observe this suffering, he felt it, breathed it, and made it his own mission to change it. Connolly's early forays into activism began in the streets and meeting halls of Dublin, where he spoke passionately to workers who had been silenced for decades. He taught them that their suffering was not a matter of fate, but the result of an unjust system. He inspired them to organize, to strike, to demand their rights, and above all, to understand that their struggle was intimately tied to the fate of Ireland itself. In these years, Connolly co-founded the Irish Socialist Republican Party, ISRP, in 1896. Unlike many politicians of his time, Connolly understood that freedom without economic justice was hollow. He argued that Ireland could only truly be free if its working class was empowered. His speeches were fiery, his writings incisive, and his presence magnetic. He did not shy away from controversy, and he never flinched from confrontation. Connolly's activism was not confined to Dublin. He traveled widely, connecting with socialist movements in Scotland and England, learning from their successes and failures. Everywhere he went, he sought to fuse workers' rights with national liberation, creating a vision that was as revolutionary as it was practical. He believed that a strike was not merely a protest against wages, it was a step toward reclaiming dignity, asserting agency, and building a society where justice prevailed. His work extended beyond speeches and writings. Connolly organized unions, led strikes, and negotiated on behalf of the oppressed, often at great personal risk. Employers and authorities saw him as dangerous, his every move was watched, and threats of imprisonment were constant. Yet, Connolly thrived in this crucible of resistance. For him, struggle was not optional, it was the very essence of life. By the turn of the century, James Connolly had emerged as the undisputed voice of Ireland's working class. His revolutionary ideals were no longer abstract theories, they were lived experiences, expressed in the chants of striking workers, the banners of the unions, and the rising consciousness of ordinary men and women who had once felt powerless. It was during these years that Connolly began to bridge the worlds of labor and politics, arguing that social change and national independence were inseparable. His writings were published in newspapers and pamphlets, spreading his vision far beyond Dublin. He warned that without economic justice, political freedom would remain incomplete, a warning that would later resonate loudly in the tumult of 1916. By the end of this period, Connolly was no longer just a man, he was a symbol, a catalyst, a spark for revolution. His relentless advocacy for workers, his visionary understanding of socialism, and his unwavering commitment to Irish self-determination laid the foundation for the epic struggles that were yet to come. By the dawn of the 20th century, James Connolly had transformed from a passionate labor leader into a revolutionary thinker whose ideas threatened the very foundations of the established order. Dublin was no longer merely a city of factories and docks. For Connolly, it was a laboratory of revolution, a place where ideas could be tested and a movement for justice could take root. In 1896, Connolly co-founded the Irish Socialist Republican Party, ISRP, but his vision extended far beyond the confines of Ireland. He believed that socialism and nationalism were inseparable. A truly free Ireland could not exist without a society where workers controlled their own lives and destinies. Unlike other politicians who sought political change through compromise, Connolly demanded radical, structural transformation. He drew inspiration from international movements, studying the successes and failures of European socialist revolutions and labor struggles in Scotland and England. He corresponded with revolutionary thinkers across borders, absorbing ideas about strikes, union organization, and workers' councils. Yet Connolly was always careful to adapt these ideas to Ireland's unique conditions. For him, foreign ideologies were not dogma, they were tools, meant to be shaped for the Irish struggle. Connolly's activism was a blend of intellectual rigor and direct action. He wrote extensively, producing essays and pamphlets that dissected the interconnectedness of colonial oppression and economic exploitation. In his mind, no worker could be truly free in a country still under imperial rule. The plight of the working poor and the quest for national liberation were two sides of the same coin. He also founded several unions, including the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, giving structure and voice to thousands of workers. Through these unions, he orchestrated strikes that challenged the power of employers and the complacency of the political elite. Connolly's leadership style was unique. He combined empathy with uncompromising resolve, ensuring that every worker knew their struggle mattered, and every action contributed to a larger revolutionary vision. Connolly's revolutionary ideas were not merely theoretical, they were practical, urgent, and often dangerous. He preached that reform alone was insufficient, that only through organized, collective action could workers dismantle the systems that oppressed them. He urged his followers to prepare not only for strikes but for a complete transformation of society, laying the groundwork for future insurrections. By this stage of his life, James Connolly had become a figure of both admiration and fear. Admirers saw him as a champion of the oppressed, a man who gave voice to the voiceless. Opponents, from British authorities to powerful industrialists, saw him as a threat to the status quo, a man whose ideas could ignite a revolution. Connolly's genius lay in his ability to synthesize theory and action, connecting the dots between poverty, exploitation, and colonial rule. He understood that the fight for labor rights was inseparable from the fight for national sovereignty. This philosophy would later define his leadership in the Easter Rising of 1916, when he would risk everything for the cause he had spent a lifetime preparing for. Behind the fiery speeches and revolutionary writings of James Connolly lay a man deeply human, shaped by love, sacrifice, and personal struggle. While history often remembers him as a leader of labor and nationalism, few pause to consider the private life that fueled his public resolve. Connolly married Lily Reynolds, a woman who shared his vision of social justice and stood by him through the storms of political activism. Together, they faced the hardships of a life committed to revolution, poverty, constant threats, and the strain of living in a society that often viewed them as dangerous radicals. Their home was modest, filled not with luxury, but with books, debates, and plans for change. It was here that Connolly's intellect and passion were nurtured in a more intimate, human dimension. Despite his public persona as a confident leader, Connolly battled physical ailments and exhaustion. Years of relentless activism, strikes, and organizing took a toll on his body. He often pushed himself beyond human limits, driven by an unyielding sense of duty to the workers he represented. This personal sacrifice was mirrored in his unwavering commitment to political causes, even when failure and imprisonment loomed large. Connolly's political activism frequently brought him into direct conflict with authorities and employers. He was arrested multiple times, beaten, and imprisoned, yet each confrontation only seemed to strengthen his resolve. Friends and comrades described him as a man of immense courage, willing to face danger to protect the dignity of the working class. His personal hardships were inseparable from his revolutionary mission. They tempered his leadership with empathy and gave authenticity to his vision. Family life, too, bore the mark of struggle. Raising children amidst political turmoil required resilience and ingenuity. Connolly's dedication to his family never waned, even as he spent long hours in union halls, writing manifestos, or traveling to organize workers. The tension between personal obligations and public duty created a constant, human drama, one that shaped Connolly into a man whose courage was rooted not in abstraction, but in lived experience. Moreover, Connolly's struggles were not only external. He wrestled with the psychological weight of leadership, the burden of representing the hopes of thousands, and the moral responsibility of advocating radical change. He understood that failure could cost lives, yet he also knew that inaction would prolong suffering. These inner conflicts added depth to his character, painting a portrait of a revolutionary who was as reflective as he was bold. In this period of his life, James Connolly emerges not merely as a political figure, but as a human being navigating the complex interplay of love, sacrifice, duty, and danger. His personal life, fraught with hardship, yet rich in conviction, prepared him for the most defining moment of his career, the leadership of the Easter Rising of 1916. It was this fusion of personal struggle and political commitment that made Connolly a leader unlike any other, a man whose courage was forged in the fires of both family devotion and revolutionary fervor. By the spring of 1916, James Connolly had spent decades preparing for a moment that could alter the course of Irish history. The streets of Dublin were tense with anticipation, the air thick with the whispers of rebellion. Connolly, now a seasoned revolutionary, knew that the struggle for workers' rights and national liberation had reached a decisive point. Connolly was a central figure in the planning of the Easter Rising, alongside other Irish nationalist leaders. Unlike many politicians of the time, Connolly insisted that the uprising must not only aim for national independence, but also incorporate a vision of social justice. For him, freedom from British rule meant little if Ireland's workers remained oppressed and impoverished. On April 24, 1916, the rebellion began. Connolly commanded the Irish Citizen Army, a disciplined force of working-class men committed to both political and social revolution. They took strategic positions across the city, including the General Post Office, GPO, which became the epicenter of the rebellion. The GPO, its walls soon scarred with gunfire, echoed with the chanting of slogans and the sound of revolutionary fervor, as Connolly coordinated the defense, inspired his troops, and maintained morale in the face of overwhelming odds. Connolly's leadership during the rising was marked by courage and tactical ingenuity. Despite being severely wounded early in the battle, he continued to direct operations from a makeshift headquarters. He moved among his men, offering guidance, encouragement, and a living example of steadfast resolve. To the soldiers who looked up to him, Connolly was more than a commander, he was the embodiment of their hopes for a just Ireland. Yet the rising was brutally suppressed. British forces, superior in numbers and firepower, systematically reclaimed the city. Connolly, immobilized by his injuries, was captured. In the eyes of the authorities, he was a dangerous revolutionary, a man whose ideas threatened not just the empire, but the very structure of society itself. Despite the imminent threat of death, Connolly's spirit remained unbroken. Even in captivity, he remained a symbol of defiance, writing letters and offering words of encouragement to his comrades. He understood that the rising, though militarily a failure, would ignite the imagination of a nation and plant the seeds for Ireland's eventual independence. The Easter Rising revealed the depth of Connolly's vision. He fought not merely for the removal of colonial rulers, but for the creation of a society where workers could live with dignity, equality, and freedom. In every barricaded street and echoing hall of Dublin, Connolly's ideals resonated, making him a revolutionary whose legacy would endure far beyond the battles of 1916. By the end of the Rising, it was clear, James Connolly had given everything, his health, his freedom, and ultimately, his life, to a cause that transcended personal ambition. He had become a living symbol of courage, sacrifice, and the intertwined struggles of labor and national liberation. The streets of Dublin fell silent after the suppression of the Easter Rising, but the echoes of rebellion continued to resonate. James Connolly, severely wounded and unable to walk without assistance, was captured by British forces. The irony of his situation was not lost on him. A man who had devoted his life to liberating Ireland now lay vulnerable, confined by the very power he had spent decades challenging. Connolly was tried by court-martial, a swift proceeding designed to crush dissent and intimidate others. The charges were clear: he had led an armed rebellion against the crown. Yet Connolly did not plead for mercy. In fact, his comportment during the trial was calm, dignified, and defiant, a testament to the strength of his convictions. To the authorities, he was a dangerous revolutionary; to the Irish people, he was already a symbol of unyielding courage. The sentence was inevitable: execution by firing squad. On May 12, 1916, James Connolly faced his final moments. Unable to stand due to his wounds, he was strapped to a chair, a grim necessity that would not diminish the magnitude of his sacrifice. Eyewitnesses described a man who met death without fear, his eyes conveying the same determination and conviction that had guided him throughout his life. Connolly's last words, whether written in letters to loved ones or spoken quietly to those around him, reflected his unwavering commitment to the cause. He urged that the struggle continue, that Ireland's people remain steadfast, and that the principles of justice, equality, and freedom never be abandoned. In death, as in life, he became more than a man; he became a living symbol of resistance and hope. His execution was intended by the British to strike terror into the hearts of rebels, yet it had the opposite effect. Across Ireland, the story of James Connolly's courage galvanized a generation, inspiring workers, activists, and nationalists alike. The brutal reality of his death only amplified the resonance of his ideas, cementing his place in history not merely as a revolutionary, but as a martyr for justice and freedom. Connolly's life and death reveal the profound interconnection between personal sacrifice and political struggle. He understood that meaningful change demanded courage, and he gave the ultimate price for a vision of Ireland that was both free and equitable. Even today, more than a century later, the image of James Connolly, wounded yet resolute, facing death for his beliefs, continues to inspire those who fight for social justice and national liberation around the world. James Connolly's death in 1916 did not mark the end of his story. On the contrary, it was the beginning of a legacy that would shape Ireland and inspire generations worldwide. His life, marked by unwavering courage, relentless advocacy for workers, and a vision of national liberation intertwined with social justice, became a blueprint for revolutionaries and reformers alike. Connolly's influence extended far beyond Ireland. His writings on socialism, labor rights, and national independence were studied by political thinkers across Europe and America. He demonstrated that true freedom was incomplete without equality, and that the liberation of a nation must go hand in hand with the empowerment of its people. His ideas bridged the worlds of theory and practice, showing that action rooted in conviction could alter the course of history. In Ireland, Connolly became a symbol of martyrdom and inspiration. The Easter Rising, though initially suppressed, ignited a national consciousness that ultimately led to Ireland's independence in 1922. Workers' movements across the country continued to draw on his principles, fighting for fair wages, better conditions, and dignity in labor. To this day, Connolly is remembered as a man who lived and died for both justice and freedom, a revolutionary whose life transcended his own time. Internationally, James Connolly's story resonates with all who seek social justice, equality, and the courage to challenge oppression. His life reminds us that meaningful change often demands personal sacrifice, unflinching commitment, and a vision that dares to imagine a better world. Connolly's enduring influence lies not just in what he achieved, but in what he inspired others to pursue long after his death. James Connolly's life was a testament to the power of conviction, courage, and relentless dedication. From the streets of Leith to the barricades of Dublin, he lived a life that fused the struggle for workers' rights with the fight for national independence. His story is not merely a chapter in history, it is a source of inspiration for all who believe that justice, freedom, and equality are worth fighting for. If you were inspired by James Connolly's extraordinary journey, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Hidden Epoch, for more powerful stories from history that you've never heard before. Every story we share brings the past to life, and your support helps us continue this journey through the ages. Subscribe now and join the Hidden Epoch community, where history speaks louder than time.